Everyone in the city knew something was wrong. For years, crime statistics dropped on paper, but shootings increased on the streets. Internal investigations disappeared, and officers who asked questions were quietly transferred. Journalists noticed first. Police reports no longer matched court records. Body camera footage was delayed, then lost. Anonymous tips described arrests that never made the news. But every reporter who tried to connect the dots ran into the same invisible wall. Editors received phone calls from city officials. Sources suddenly stopped answering, and reporters were warned, politely at first, that certain stories were not in the public interest. Behind it all was one powerful figure, a man who didn't give interviews, a man who controlled promotions, budgets, and silence. He never threatened journalists directly. Instead, he let them know he was always watching, and that was usually enough. Usually. The warnings never came in writing. They came as missed calls from unknown numbers, as unmarked cars idling outside newsrooms, as friendly advice whispered by people who looked nervous saying it. One investigative reporter found her car door scratched after requesting internal police emails. Another noticed his apartment buzzer ringing at 3 a.m. with no one there. Officially, none of it was connected. Unofficially, journalists compared notes quietly. Same names, same departments, same stories killed right before publication. One editor finally pulled a major investigation after a city official hinted the station's broadcast license might need reviewing. The message was clear. You can report crime, just not this crime. Most reporters backed off. They had families, mortgages, careers. But one journalist did something different. Instead of stopping, he started recording everything. Every call, every warning, every quiet threat. His name wasn't famous. He wasn't a TV star. He was a local investigative reporter with a small audience and a reputation for patience. When the warnings started, he didn't confront anyone. He documented them. He saved voicemails where voices stopped just short of threats. He filmed police refusing routine public records. He recorded meetings where officials spoke carefully, choosing words like landmines. Most importantly, he created copies, encrypted drives, cloud backups, files sent to colleagues outside the city, because he understood something crucial. If intimidation stayed private, it worked. But if it went public, it became evidence. He kept working quietly for months, building a timeline of pressure, interference, and silence. Then one night, after receiving a warning that crossed a line, he made a decision that would change everything. The next broadcast wouldn't be quiet. It would be impossible to ignore. The warning that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday night. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't coded, and it wasn't anonymous. The reporter received a call from a senior city official, someone who should never have been contacting him directly. The tone was calm, professional, almost friendly. But the message was unmistakable. He was told his recent inquiries were creating instability, that continuing would affect people close to him, and that certain institutions had long memories. The call ended without a threat being spoken out loud. But for the first time, the pressure wasn't abstract. It was personal. Instead of reacting emotionally, the reporter did what he'd trained himself to do. He hit save. The entire call was recorded, backed up, time-stamped. Then he opened his notes and wrote a single sentence. "This is no longer about corruption. This is about intimidation." That night, he began preparing a broadcast that would expose not just crimes, but the attempt to silence them. The segment was scheduled for a late-night slot. Low viewership, minimal oversight. Exactly the kind of time controversial stories quietly disappear. But this time, the reporter made one change. Before airing, he uploaded the full segment, unedited, to multiple platforms simultaneously: social media, independent news sites, encrypted mirrors. Then, on air, he did something unexpected. Instead of starting with corruption allegations, he played the recordings, voicemails, phone calls, warnings disguised as advice. Viewers heard officials urging restraint, threatening consequences, carefully choosing words to avoid legal trouble. The reporter looked directly into the camera and said only one sentence: "If something happens to me, you'll know why." The broadcast ended. Within minutes, the clip began spreading. By morning, it was everywhere. The reaction was immediate and uncontrollable. By sunrise, the broadcast had been viewed millions of times. National journalists began calling. Legal analysts dissected every word. Former officers started reaching out. What made the story explode wasn't just corruption. It was proof of intimidation. Screenshots of threats spread online. Audio clips were replayed on national radio. Hashtags demanding accountability trended worldwide. City officials scrambled. Statements were issued denying everything, then quietly deleted. Phones went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. Most telling of all, the powerful figure at the center of the storm didn't appear in public. For the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the narrative. Because intimidation only works in silence, and overnight, silence was no longer an option. What happened next was something investigators hadn't expected. People started talking. Former police officers emailed the newsroom from anonymous accounts. Dispatchers described altered call logs. Evidence technicians admitted reports were rewritten after arrests. One message stood out. A retired officer claimed he'd been ordered to delete body camera footage after a violent arrest years earlier. When he refused, he was reassigned, then quietly pushed into early retirement. Journalists verified what they could. Names were cross-checked. Dates matched internal schedules. This wasn't one bad decision. It was a system. The reporter released a follow-up segment, not accusations, just documentation. Timelines, emails, internal memos. Each release made it harder for officials to deny involvement. Each new whistleblower added weight. And for the first time, police leadership realized something dangerous. This story was no longer controllable. It was multiplying. Behind closed doors, panic set in. Emergency meetings were called at police headquarters. Attorneys advised silence. Public relations teams scrambled to craft explanations that wouldn't hold up. Internal emails later revealed confusion. Who had authorized the warnings? Who knew about the recordings? And how much evidence was still unreleased? Command staff ordered audits, not to find the truth, but to locate leaks. Officers were reminded of loyalty policies. Access to internal databases was quietly restricted. Badge scans were monitored. But the pressure backfired. More people reached out to journalists, afraid evidence would disappear. The reporter received a package at the station, no return address. Inside were flash drives labeled by date and unit. The files contained internal recordings that contradicted public statements made just days earlier. At that moment, the investigation crossed a point of no return. This wasn't a media story anymore. It was becoming a criminal one. The involvement of outside agencies changed everything. After national coverage, federal investigators announced a preliminary review, carefully worded but unmistakable. Subpoenas followed quietly. Phone records, email servers, financial disclosures. City officials who once refused interviews suddenly hired attorneys. The powerful figure at the center of the storm issued his first public statement in years. It denied wrongdoing, criticized irresponsible journalism, and accused the media of creating hysteria. But the statement raised more questions than answers, because investigators already had something he didn't know about. A recording made years earlier, stored outside the city's control, that placed him in a meeting where intimidation strategies were discussed openly. The broadcast hadn't just gone viral, it had drawn the attention of people who couldn't be warned into silence. The recording wasn't dramatic at first. No shouting, no raised voices. Just a quiet meeting in a government conference room years earlier. Several officials sat around a table discussing media management. At first, it sounded harmless. Then the language shifted. One voice suggested delaying information requests until reporters lost interest. Another recommended reminding editors how dependent their stations were on city access. Then came the line investigators couldn't ignore. A senior official calmly explained that journalists who kept pushing could be pressured indirectly through zoning inspections, licensing reviews, or attention to family members. No one objected. The man leading the meeting approved the strategy and ended the discussion. That voice belonged to the same figure who later claimed intimidation never happened. When federal investigators authenticated the audio, the case shifted instantly. This wasn't rumor, it wasn't interpretation, it was policy, spoken out loud. Once the recording was confirmed, everything accelerated. Officials who once stood united began distancing themselves. Emails leaked showing concern about personal exposure. Meeting calendars were edited. Public statements contradicted one another. Behind the scenes, resignations were discussed quietly. One senior police administrator stepped down, citing health reasons. Another announced an early retirement within days. Then came the first search warrant. Federal agents entered city offices early one morning, removing computers and storage devices while staff were told to remain seated. Photos leaked almost immediately. The image that spread fastest showed the powerful figure leaving the building, face expressionless, surrounded by attorneys. The reporter who started it all watched from the newsroom. He didn't celebrate, because he knew something important. When systems start breaking, they often break violently. Public opinion changed almost overnight. People who once dismissed the story now demanded answers. City council meetings filled with residents. Former officers spoke publicly for the first time. Civil rights groups filed lawsuits citing years of suppression. Media outlets that once avoided the topic began competing to uncover more details. The reporter became a reluctant symbol. He refused interviews focused on him and redirected attention to documents, timelines, and verified evidence. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated charges: intimidation, obstruction, conspiracy. Each charge depended on proving that silencing journalists wasn't incidental, it was intentional. And with every new witness, that argument became stronger. The city had crossed a threshold. The question was no longer, did corruption exist? It was, how far did it go? The announcement came on a Friday afternoon. Federal prosecutors confirmed what many suspected but few believed would actually happen. Formal charges were being filed: obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, conspiracy to misuse public authority. The charging documents detailed a pattern, not isolated incidents, but coordinated efforts to discourage scrutiny. Emails, recorded meetings, testimony from former insiders. Most damaging of all were references to journalists by name, labeled as problems that needed to be managed. The powerful figure who once denied everything now stood accused of orchestrating silence. His attorney released a statement calling the charges politically motivated. But prosecutors didn't rely on politics. They relied on documentation, and they had years of it. When the reporter was called to testify, the courtroom was packed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't editorialize. He simply played the recordings. Voicemails warning him to stop. Calls implying consequences. Meetings where officials danced around threats. Jurors watched carefully. This wasn't speculation. It was a timeline. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys suggested he misinterpreted intentions. He responded calmly, "If it wasn't intimidation, why did it stop when it became public?" The room went silent. Other journalists testified next. So did former officers. So did city employees. Piece by piece, a culture of pressure emerged. Quiet, calculated, and designed to leave no fingerprints. Except one: the recordings. The verdict didn't come quickly. Jurors deliberated for days, reviewing transcripts and audio carefully. When they returned, no one spoke. The foreperson stood and read the decision: guilty on multiple counts. The courtroom reacted quietly. No cheers, no celebration. Because the case wasn't about one man, it was about a system that believed silence could be enforced. Sentencing would come later. Resignations followed immediately. Policies were rewritten, oversight boards created, independent auditors installed. But for many, the damage lingered. Trust doesn't return overnight, and power, once exposed, never looks the same again. Months later, the reporter returned to work. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as proof that intimidation fails when documented. The city still struggled. Reforms took time. Skepticism remained. But journalists asked harder questions now. Officers reported misconduct more freely. Public meetings were recorded and archived. The broadcast that once seemed dangerous was now taught in journalism schools as a case study in accountability. The lesson was simple and costly. Threats thrive in the dark. Power depends on silence. And corruption survives only when no one records it. Because one broadcast didn't just go viral, it proved something far more important. The truth doesn't need permission to be heard. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real change. And if you'd like more stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light.